Thank you, Eugene, for reading that scripture. Good morning, church. Happy New Year to you. It is only the 6th day of the year. We got 299 days to go, so we all need to be cheerful. All right, I like New Year's because for some people, it is a time where they get to do things that they wanted to do last year or the year before, and finally this year, hopefully they get to do it. And some of us are into New Year resolutions, and I myself do keep a list of things that I want to do. Not really resolutions, but some things that I like to do for the year. Tidy up the room, tidy up my computer, and so on. And so, it is always good to have a new year because we have a chance to really do things or resolve to do things for the year that sometimes has been missing for the past year. I came across a true story, of a husband who was constantly nagged by his wife for forgetting to cap the toothpaste after he used it. So finally one day he says, okay, from now onwards, I will consciously cap the toothpaste each time after I use it. And so he did it. After a week, it went on for a while, and one morning the wife looked at him rather suspiciously. Said, how come you stop brushing your teeth? Sometimes New Year resolutions can get you unexpected reactions and outcome. But certainly, we want good outcomes and good reactions whenever we want to do something that's good. But what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks as we look forward to the new year is that we want to look from the book of 2 Timothy on becoming a faithful minister for Christ, taking from what Paul wrote to Timothy. And if you have not read 2 Timothy, I think you should read it because it's a lot of encouraging messages, a lot of affirmation, and also bits of caution against false teachers and so on. And so it's a good book for us to start this new year. And so for the next 4 weeks, as we look at the 4 different chapters, we hope that the message will encourage you this year to resolve to be a faithful minister or servant for Christ. And this morning in particular, I'll look at chapter 1, which was just read by Eugene earlier on. And so when we talk about serving God in His kingdom, there's a saying that in some churches, there are many willing members. Some are willing to serve. Some are willing for these willing people to serve. But of course, that's not desirable because the Lord wants all of us to serve, to be part of the body, serving Him and helping the body to grow. But there are possibly many categories of people that we know in the church. And I'm going to share with you some of these, and perhaps if you can identify with some of them. There are people who bug out. And these are the people who have served, but then they are wounded by criticism, and they find that there are conflict in the church. They try to do what they can, or people criticize them for somehow, and then they give up. They bug out. They decide not to serve God. Or there are people who try serving, and then they grew frustrated, and then they quit. Frustrated because what they want to do is not aligned with the vision and mission of the church. And so they say, well, I'd rather not do it, and then they quit. And there may be others who are burnt out. They try to do too much. These are the people that cannot say no. Help me in this, yes. Help me in that. In the end, they are overwhelmed. And they become ineffective. And they become overburdened. And they give up as well. And they become burnt out. Or they serve because of the wrong motivation. They feel that if I serve God, people will commend me. I feel good. There's this sense of affirmation. But when all these things are missing, the motivation are gone. And then they are also fizzle out. Or there are others who are weary of serving the Lord. They've been doing this for many years. And that's why 1 Corinthians 15 cautioned us that we are not to be weary in serving God. But there are people who may be weary and they become burnt out. But there may be others who also rust out. They don't do anything and become rusty. Whatever gifts that God has given them is neglected due to disuse. Partly because of the half-hearted commitment to God. They want to be part of the world, they want to be part of God. They're not sure where they are. And in the end, they decide not to serve God. or it's because of the apathy in their life. They think that, well, it doesn't matter, life goes on, the church will carry on, don't need my help. And so they don't put in their fair share. Or they're even complacent about their own faith. We may be part of them, or you can identify with some of them. But you may not. But having said that, there may be some of us who are facing cases whereby our fire is dying. The passion in us is dying. And that we find that we have no energy to face the demands of life. There's a lack of willpower to avoid temptations, and a lack of strength to even face the crises and tragedies of life. Something is diminishing inside us, and we feel weak. We feel that we are unable to do what God wants us to do. The idea of this is that we're not going to highlight all this to put people down, but really to realize that we all need our spirits to be revived, to be restored. You know that following Jesus, serving Him, involves risk and tension. Risk because, people may take advantage of us. Risk because we are vulnerable. And there's always this tension between godly and worldly choices that we have to face daily. And so, as a result, we always feel that we need God to help us, to revive us in our Christian walk and service to Him. And we want God to help us to stir up the fire in us, to rekindle our gift and commitment to God. And so this morning, as we look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is precisely encouraging Timothy to do that. And like the embers that we saw in the first slide, our gift is actually not dead. It is still there. It is maybe dormant, but it's for us to ask God to help us to rekindle that for His kingdom's glory. And so as we look into the text, let us look at the two main characters of the text, Paul and Timothy. Let's look at Paul. At this point of time in 2 Timothy, Paul is in prison. Now this is not the house arrest that he was in when you read about in Acts, but this is the point whereby he's in Rome in the dungeons. And dungeons are cold, damp, dark places. And likewise, Paul is also in poor health, as you can read from his epistle. And he knew that his ministry is coming to an end because he's old, poor health. That's why he wrote in chapter 4, he tells Timothy to come quickly because he don't know how long he's going to last. And of all the person and churches that he chose to write his last letter, and this is his last letter, he chose to write to Timothy. And I guess partly because he knew Timothy very well. He knows his strength, he knows his weaknesses, and he wants to affirm and encourage Timothy. How about Timothy? Timothy is someone that's influenced by his mother and grandmother. And that's where parents play an important role in the lives of the children. Timothy is who he is then because of the influence of his mother and grandmother. But then he's also a timid guy. He's sensitive to people speaking about his youth. He's not exactly young. He's in the 30s, but back then is considered young. And so people perhaps look down as a result because of his age. And he's also not in the best of health. Two characters in this book of Timothy. But both of them, Paul and Timothy, were together in the missionary trips. They shared their life, their joy, their sufferings together. They have seen people who have accepted the gospel. They have seen people who have rejected the gospel. They were that close. To the point that Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 2, 20 to 22, that I have no one else like Timothy who genuinely cares about your welfare. All others care for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. But you know how Timothy has proved himself. Like a son with his father, he has helped me in preaching the good news. He was very close to Timothy. And because he is close to Timothy, perhaps he is sensing that Timothy's faith or work in God's kingdom may be wavering. I mean, you read the 2 Timothy, perhaps you read between the lines, it seems like what he writes is in anticipation of what could have happened to Timothy if he did not affirm or encourage him. And so he wrote this. And that's why we have 2 Timothy chapter 1. That Paul wrote this to encourage, to comfort, and to strengthen Timothy. And what is relevant to Timothy then, and I believe is relevant to us even today. And so, I will not read the text, but just pay attention to those that are marked in red, underlined in red, And that's where we will focus our lesson or message on this morning. You talk about Timothy's sincere faith. You talk about fanning into flame the gift of God. And talk about the Spirit of God that does not make us timid, but give us power, love, and self-discipline. And not to be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of me, his prisoner. And further down, he talk about there's no cause to be ashamed. Another time he talk about being ashamed. Because I know whom I believe, and am convinced that he's able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. And again he talk about Onesiphorus, that he was not ashamed of Paul's being in chain. And so what are the lessons that we can gather from this morning? And this is to do with our service to God. Number one, we need to remember to rekindle our faith. Now, when we talk about rekindling, we think about campfires. Some of you, or even barbecue. I'm a scout before, so I know about campfire. When the fire first started, you'll start burning brightly, but eventually you'll die down, and then what is left is the embers. But the point is that the fire is not dead yet. If you take time to fan the embers, put in a bit more wood, the fire will come alive again. And that's the essence of what rekindling is all about. Or keep afresh. Essentially, don't let the fire die. Continue to fan the fire or fan the embers so that your fire will not die. And we need to do that. Paul is telling Timothy, you have the sincere faith. You have the gift that God has given you. Keep it alive for the kingdom of God. Now, you do not know I don't know what God has gifted you, but let us realize that gifts are not just about abilities and competencies. Sometimes we think that, the gift is only what you're competent to do or you have these certain abilities. But it can be anything. Because when you look at the disciples, they are fishermen, they are tax collectors, and so on. They are not trained people. They are not eloquent. They make mistakes. But the thing about gifts is that God has gifted us, all of us, regardless. Every one of us is gift. But it is our responsibility then to discover it, to nurture it, and to act on it. Think of it as part of our DNA. We need to discover it, we need to nurture it, and we need to act on it. But how do we do that? Then I'll share with you my example. I don't want to share with other people's example because then I may say something wrong. But I'll share with you my example. When I became a Christian in 1975, and that's some time ago, I don't know what my gifts are. All right? And so, like any new Christian, I'll do everything and anything you tell me to do. All right? Back then, we used to do house-to-house trekking, and I became quite an expert, we put those tracks into the mailbox very fast. We can cover a lot of houses in a very short time. But perhaps that's not my gift. I also help out in the church printing. Back then, we don't have those laser printer or some of these that we have now. We have what we call the cycle-styling machine, and we did the Queenstown newsletter, where, you got to type on this stencil and then put on this machine and then print out. Not an easy task, but I tried that. But maybe that's not my gift. And so I move on. I tried singing and I tried preaching. Now, preaching is somewhere that, something that, if you look at the picture, I started quite young. Being a new preacher, like everyone else, my whole sermon is scripted. I have to write everything down and then start talking from there. All right. I tried it for a while, but there's one occasion I thought maybe my preaching may not be my gift. Because as I was preaching, someone in the audience, one of the members, actually fell asleep and fell down. So I was quite worried. I know Simon knows who he is. All right. And some of you may know. So I'm not sure whether that is my gift. But I persevere and try again. And also I start organizing church events. As you can see, youth gospel rally, inter-congregation activities, and so on. To today, what I am. My point about this is that we discover our gifts by serving. We cannot think that, let me look at my gifts and then start to serve. Actually, as we serve God, we find that there are some things that we do better that has a greater impact and influence on others. And that is our gift in God's kingdom. And that people affirm you for that. You are doing a good job organizing this. You are doing a good job by providing for people. It can be many and varied kinds of gifts. Gifts of providing, gifts of hospitality, gifts of organizing things, of ministering to those in need, of just being there. Some of you may remember Brother Philip Young. When you think of Brother Philip Young, you think of a person that goes to hospital all the time. When someone is in hospital, he's there. He has the gift of being there. Just being there. He may not say much, but he's always there when you're in hospital. That's what people remember him for. And so we need to nurture them. We need to discover them as we serve God. Nurture them and act upon them for God's kingdom and glory. We don't wait for our gifts to think what we have to give and then serve God. We start serving God and we discover them along the way. Think of it as our DNA. But while we try to keep the fire and the flame alive, let us remember and be mindful of the things that can drowse our flame. From discouragement to worldly desires to busyness to bitterness, pride, and many others. Sometimes it may not be you that try to drowse this fire. It can be others. We have to be mindful of them and ask God to strengthen us, to help us to continue. Ask God's Spirit to help us to continue to fan the flame in us, to fan the gift in us, that we may give it all to Him for His glory. And so, the first thing that Paul encourages Timothy, and encourages us in 2 Timothy 1, is to rekindle our gift. And secondly, two attitudes that we need to have when we think about rekindling our gift. And one attitude is that we need to be unafraid. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, of love, and of self-discipline." God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power. Now, when we think of power, it's not about your position, that you are high up in that hierarchy, that you have all the power. It's not about your forceful personality that you can, what you say people follow. But rather, the power comes from God. 2 Corinthians says that we are just like earthen jars of clay. The power, the all-surpassing power comes from God, not from us. And it is God's power that enabled us to live a life of boldness. Because we can say that if God is for us, who can be against us? It is God's power that enables us to say or do things that change the situation. To take a lead that others will follow. To say things of words of wisdom that bring healing and hope to others. It's not our doing. We are the instrument. But it's God's power that works through us that enables us to do all this. And to help us to overcome the fear. You know that fear is one of Satan's weapons. Because when we are fearful, we focus on ourselves, our own resources, rather than focus on God and God's resources. Just like Peter, when he tried to walk on the water, when he focused on Jesus' ability to help him walk on the water, he was able to do it. But he started to be fearful and look at the waves. What happened? He sank. And so, help us to overcome that fear. But the fear is not of just persecution. Maybe we don't have persecution nowadays, but rather the fear of what people said about us and their reaction if we proclaim the gospel. There's this fear in us. But realize that God doesn't make us timid. God's power is able to overcome that. And of course, it says that He gives us a spirit of love, because power without love will result in destruction. It becomes destructive. It needs to be tempered, it needs to be balanced with love and compassion. Otherwise, power, absolute power, can be destructive. And we know that there's no fear in love, because perfect love drives out fear. We are not fearful, because if we love, we are able to drive out the fear in us. And finally, in the same verse, you talk about a spirit of self-discipline. Some versions put it as self-control, sound mind, prudence. Essentially, it's discernment and discipline in exercising our power and our love. And so the attitude that we must have, Paul was saying, as we attempt to rekindle our gift, is that we need to have the attitude of being unafraid. The second attitude that we need to have is that to be unashamed. A classic example of someone who was fearful, who was ashamed, and eventually denied Jesus was Peter. He was in the courtyard, he was moving around, people recognized him. Hey, you know Jesus? He said, no, I don't know him. There's fear in him. Perhaps he's a little embarrassed because Jesus was captured to be tried. These are the people that after a while, because of that, they want to distance themselves from Jesus. And that's why Paul wrote in Timothy 3 times about being ashamed. Don't be ashamed. Onesiphorus was not ashamed of me even though I'm in the chain. And that's very important because in a status-conscious society, back then, even today also, when you go to prison, there's a certain stigma about you. And Paul even wrote that those people in Asia Minor has really deserted him. He even named 2 persons. They already deserted him because they don't want to be associated with him. They are embarrassed. This guy went to prison again. But before we comment and perhaps critique people like all these people or even Peter, perhaps we want to ask ourselves this morning, are we ashamed of Christ? And that's why we need to do a bit of soul searching. Are there occasions whereby we are embarrassed to speak of Him? Maybe in a setting when we're all talking about religion, and then we keep quiet. We don't dare to speak up for Christ. Or when someone says something that is not true about Christ, we don't want to talk about it. Or we are afraid that we will be rejected by our peers. We want to be part of the gang, But if we tell people that we are Christians, then we may be rejected. They may not include us. But there are times whereby we are embarrassed to tell people we are Christians because our life is not fully consistent with our belief. The way we talk, the way we think, the way we conduct ourselves, we better don't tell people that we are Christian. Then they'll say, you are Christian and yet you do these things? We are embarrassed to tell people that. And there may be occasions where our reputation or position are at stake. In our career progression, sometimes, yes, you worry that if you tell people that I'm a Christian, it may be taken against us somehow. And so we are ashamed to even tell them that I'm a Christian, that I know Christ. But whatever it is, I think it's for us to pay attention to it. And what does Paul say? What is the antidote to being ashamed? He mentioned in 2 Timothy 1:12, for these reasons I suffer these things. Paul suffered it. And perhaps you may be going through such things. But I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed. He didn't say I know what I have believed. It is the person, Jesus, whom I have believed. And I am convinced that He is able to guard all that I have entrusted unto Him until that day. So the antidote for being ashamed, or for the fear of being ashamed, is that we need to be convinced that Jesus is able. We need to believe that Jesus, who has shown us His love, His power, and His promises and assurance to us, that we will trust Him, that we will not be ashamed of Him. And so, when we go about trying to rekindle our gift, our commitment to God, let us have this attitude of being unafraid, being unashamed, that we continue to serve God and not allow all this to hinder us, and that we are courageously bold to speak for Christ when the time or when the need calls for it. And lastly, it is a lifetime of serving God. Paul and Timothy have shown the example. Now, God does not have a retirement program. Some of us may think that there is. 62 years old, you can go early retirement, 65, full retirement. No, there's no retirement program in God's eye. I can't even find it in the Bible, by the way. There are senior citizens that keep on serving. And this year I'm going to be one of them, if you don't believe it. that they continue to serve as long as they are able. Yes, some may start to reduce some of the roles that they're doing, but they continue to do that. We got examples of people that come our way, people like Ned Cooper, Bobby Deason. And within our church, we also know of some examples. Bang Ti Liang, he's in the 70s, I think. He doesn't look 70, but he's in the 70s. We have Sister Dorothy, continue to be active in the Triple F. We have Sister Nancy Tan, teaching the children's Bible class, and many others. These people continue to serve God. And why I say that? Because we do not allow some of these things to hinder us, whether it's age or health. Example is in Paul and Timothy. Paul is old. Paul is in poor health. He's in a really difficult situation in the dungeons. And yet he continued to write letters to encourage people, encourage Timothy. Timothy is young. Yes, people look down on his youth, but that did not hinder him. So don't allow this to hinder you. How about personal ability and lack of training? Timothy faced that. People look down on his youth, he's not trained, but he continued to serve God anyway. And so 2 Timothy chapter 1, by reading it, tells us that we should not allow this to stop us from serving God. There's a saying, just because I cannot do something perfectly should not slow me down from doing what I can. Whether you are a parent, a spouse, or Christian. So imagine a parent one day tell the children, I'm not a perfect parent, so from tomorrow onwards, I'll stop being a parent. That'd be quite shocking. Or you're a spouse. I'm not a perfect spouse, so maybe tomorrow onwards, I'll stop being a spouse. No, you continue to fulfill your role as a parent. You continue to fulfill your role as a spouse. And whatever role that you are in, even though you're not perfect. And that goes for you being a Christian and follower of Jesus Christ. You are not perfect. You probably will struggle and stumble. But that should not stop you from serving God, from continuing to following Jesus Christ. And we can have the example of what Jesus mentioned about the woman who washed his head and feet in Mark chapter 14 and John chapter 12. And we know that is Mary. When she broke the jar of perfume, it's expensive. She was criticized by the disciples. And the people looked down on her. But what did Jesus say? Jesus said she did what she could for him at the point of time. She did what she could. And I think we need to have that attitude. That it doesn't matter how perfectly you are able to do things. You probably never be able to do everything perfectly. But we should have the attitude that we want to do what we could for Jesus when we can. And so this question we need to ask ourselves this morning is that, are we doing what we could with the gifts that God has given you now? Because Mary did not wait for a better time. Yes, in front of the disciples, it could be embarrassing. She still do it because she never know. And it's true enough. After that, Jesus was crucified and move on. That may be the time that she wants to do it. Do it when Jesus is around. And so let us be encouraged that whatever your hands finds to do it with all your might. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 10 says. And Colossians chapter 3 verse 17 also encourages us. And whatever you do, whether in deed or in word or deed, do it in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And do it now. Because delay will erode our resolve. Delay will erode our desire to do what God wants. And so, in summary, my encouragement to you this morning, as we think about a resolution for this year, as we think of our race, our Christian race, as what Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 says, there's a race marked out for us. Chapter 12 verse 1 says that we need to run with perseverance. And so as we start this year, as we start to think about running, let us remember then to rekindle our gift. Don't let it die. It may be dormant, doesn't matter. Ask God to help you to rekindle it and serve him in his kingdom. We need to have the attitude of being unafraid and unashamed. Because unless we are courageously bold for Christ, we cannot do much for him. We let other things hinder us and impede us. And finally, we need to do it now. We don't know what tomorrow may hold for you. Yes, it's a noble idea that yes, in time to come, when there's better days, better opportunities, I'll do it. No. God gives you opportunities every day. Pockets of opportunities. It's what are you going to do with them when you have the opportunity? Do it when you can. Do it now. This morning, there's a song of invitation. It may be that some of you are facing such situations that we talked about earlier on, that you need revival. You need God to restore your soul, restore your spirit. We ask that you consider it carefully. And if you do have that need, you can write it down or you can come forward when the invitation song is sung. Or there may be some of you who are at the threshold, some visitors at the threshold, becoming part of the family of God. Whatever your needs may be, you can write it down, you can come forward, and the church will attend to that need. Shall we stand for the invitation song?